Today is an opportunity for us to talk about the Specialisation Verification Framework and in particular learn more about the experiences of people impacted by forced adoption and separation. We will have a quick conversation about the background of the framework, what it's for, what difference it can make both for organisations but also for the community as well. Undoubtedly, the best part of these workshops has been our panel discussions. So we will have a conversation and then be able to learn more from our panellists, Joe and Jude, who I'll introduce in just a moment. We'll also really quickly have a look at the process for applying for specialisation verification and some of the criteria and evidence that's required to support your application. And then, as I said, we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions at the end. Before we launch in, I want to say a really big thank you and welcome to our panellists, Joe and Jude, who both come to us from ARMS in Victoria. I was wondering if you'd be willing just to give us a really quick sort of one-sentence introduction about who you are and why you are here as part of our panel today.
I had my son in 1971 when I was 17 and met him when he was 19. And after I met him, I joined ARMS support group. And since 2011, I've been secretary of the committee. And we run support group meetings on the first Saturday of every month, which we've done for 41 years now without fail. And that's when ARMS was founded in 1982. And we also have a website, and we do telephone counselling and meeting up one-on-one just to try and help as many women as we can, because a support group is not everybody's cup of tea. So we do it in any way that's possible to help them. And there are hundreds of thousands of babies throughout Australia that were taken and then, generally speaking, adopted. So there are a lot of women who really need a lot of help and support, because it's a very traumatic thing to have your baby taken away from you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Wonderful to have you here.
I was 14 when my pregnancy was diagnosed. I didn't really know that I was pregnant at 14. And so my daughter was born at the old Queen Vic when I was 15. And I didn't see her. And so for 17 and a half years, well, I didn't see the front of her. So for 17 and a half years, I was just desperate to know that she looked normal, that she was normal. And, so she was taken away. I never saw her again, never saw the front of her. And I was, for the most of the pregnancy, I was in a home for unmarried mothers called Keedish. And, so I just, after she was taken away, I was expected to just get on and go back to school, pretend nothing had happened, and life was meant to just go on as normal. And so we met over dinner in Camberwell after I'd initiated contact when Kate was in year 12. So she was 17 and a half. And, and we've got a fabulous relationship now.
And not only do you have your own experience of that removal of Kate from your life, but also you've gone on to work as a nurse and have experience, I guess, on the other side of delivering support and services to people. So a really fantastic blend of experiences that you're able to share with people today, of being on both sides of the fence, I guess, in terms of being someone that has experienced this themselves, but also providing support to others. So thank you as well for being here. It's wonderful. I know that we've got lots to learn from you both. Before we talk more about forced adoption specifically, I just want to provide a few reminders about the Specialisation Verification Framework, what it is and where it's come from. The Specialisation Verification Framework has come about as a result of one of the recommendations from the Royal Commission into aged care. The Royal Commission really highlighted that right across the sector, we need to be better equipped at being able to respond to the diversity within our community, and that we all have a responsibility to be able to deliver services that are safe and inclusive for all older Australians. Not just the ones that are already working within our services, but that we need to get better at understanding the breadth of experiences and circumstances and identities of the people that we're working with. What came through really strongly was that importance of flexible, tailored, person-centred and strengths-based kind of models of care for everybody. What we are starting to see as well is a much stronger emphasis on the importance of trauma-informed care and all staff being equipped to be able to deliver that kind of support. More specifically, one of the recommendations talked about the fact that as providers, if we are going to communicate to the community that we're equipped to deliver specialised services to people with a whole range of different experiences, that we needed to have evidence to be able to back that up. And that's what the Specialisation Verification Framework is here to do. It was developed by Australian Healthcare Associates through consultation with providers and community members and experts across the space. And they've developed specific criteria for each of the special needs groups that are identified within the Aged Care Act. To be able to say that we have evidence to demonstrate that we're equipped to be able to provide support to people who identify with those different diversity characteristics. Applications began in June 2022. And so for lots of providers, we're still learning about how that might apply and what happens next, I guess. One of the biggest changes, I guess, that comes about when you are verified as a provider is the information that is available on the Find a Provider tool that people can use to search. Lots of people, whether it be older people themselves or the people around them, but also aged care assessors, use the information on the Find a Provider tool to find a service that is a right fit for them. When you are searching for a provider, you can filter your search according to a whole lot of different things, including the type of support that you're looking for, where the service is delivered. But on top of that, you can also search for providers that are equipped to deliver specialised care. So you can see here that these additional filters are here. And in terms of the Specialisation Verification Framework, it only applies to this first box around specialised care. What used to happen is that providers could self-nominate whether they were equipped to provide more specialised care. Now you have to be verified to be able to demonstrate that. There are these additional filters in terms of being able to deliver services, for example, for people with dementia, people that speak different languages or belong to different faiths. Those are not included within the Specialisation Verification Framework. However, if you refine your search by specialisation, you can see that the different special needs groups are identified there, and then that will come up within your search, who is verified. At the moment, in Australia, there are no providers yet who are verified as being specialists at working with people affected by forced adoption and removal of their children. So I'm showing you instead a page for CoHealth, which is verified for 3 different characteristics. You can see that big tick comes up, and then when you click into that, you can actually look at which evidence or criteria the organisation met to be able to achieve that specialisation. That means that, as I said, assessors, providers, etc., can search for that, and they can actually look at who is verified and therefore has evidence to back up that they're equipped and ready to be able to deliver that more specialist service. Absolutely, that helps make sure that people can feel more confident about finding a service that is a good fit for them, with really reliable information to back up that decision about making a choice about which service they want to work with. We also know that there is real benefit, I guess, for assessors to be able to use that information to make referrals to the most appropriate services. And as a service provider, it also means that hopefully you can receive those referrals and be recognised for that additional work that you're doing, really focusing on that diversity and inclusion. It's a great way to be able to promote your service and share the messages with the community about that work that you're doing and any special areas of interest that you are equipped to be able to support. Regardless of whether you go down the track of applying for specialisation verification or not, I think understanding the framework can be incredibly helpful. It can really help you better understand what good practice looks like and what are the kind of things that you can be working on and working towards as part of your broader quality improvement to be able to deliver inclusive services for all older people. Specialisation verification is that additional step that you can take. It's really important, though, to recognise that all aged care providers are required to be delivering and be able to demonstrate that we're delivering safe and inclusive care as part of our aged care quality standards. That is fundamental for everybody. Applying for verification is a step above that to say you're going above and beyond to deliver that specialist care. Within the Aged Care Act, there are 9 special needs groups identified, and parents affected by forced adoption or separation are one of those special needs groups. Just want to acknowledge, though, that the language in the Aged Care Act talks specifically about parents affected by forced adoption. They are certainly not the only people affected by forced adoption. And I think that best practice, sort of bigger picture, would move away from the language of just speaking about parents to people affected by forced adoption, because obviously it has a really widespread impact, certainly on the parents, the people who are adopted, broader families, siblings, grandparents, etc., all the people around that person or people as well.
Kate's right there. It's what we call the ripple effect of adoption. So it doesn't only affect the young woman who had the baby and it was then taken from her. It also affects any further relationships that she might have with a partner or with further children, with her parents and with other extended members of the family. The thing with having had a child taken from you in this way is that it's a very secret part of society. It certainly was back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and the 90s to a degree, where it was, as Jude said before, she was just told to go back to school, pretend it didn't happen, get on with your life. That's what we were all told. And the baby was a blank slate, and so they could just, the adoptive parents could just put their life onto this child and treat it, and in fact it said in its new birth certificate, as if born to. So we were just told to get on with our lives, pretend it didn't happen, and then go on and have what they called our own children, as if this child wasn't our own child. So it's that secrecy and guilt and shame that are very, very prevalent, and really in a lot of cases makes it a very secret thing in life. ARMD used to be, well, when it was first founded, it was called Association of Relinquishing Mothers. We have come to understand that we didn't relinquish our children. There was a baby market for a start, and the children, we had no choice. We were either coerced or they were illegally taken. We had signatures forged. We were forced into signing documents. We were told that the baby would languish in an institution, an orphanage, for the rest of its life if we didn't sign the adoption papers. So therefore, we decided a number of years ago that we would change the name, wanting to keep the same acronym to association representing mothers separated by adoption. And so we don't use the word relinquishing anymore. We see ourselves, because we are, as these sons and daughters' mothers. We're not their birth mother, their biological mother, or their DNA mother was one I heard recently. We are their mothers. We gave birth to them, and they are forever our children. So language is extremely important. And also the attitudes, for want of a better word, or assumptions that people have, that once you have met your son or daughter, that's the end of the horrible part. Everything's fine now. It's all happy ever after. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So there's, everybody really needs to be very, very aware that they are coming from a trauma-informed lens, and that they can challenge their own assumptions into what, because people who have not been in this situation can be as sympathetic as they like, but they really don't have any understanding of what's involved with it. So they really have to challenge their own assumptions that they've had for their entire lives. That adoption is a wonderful thing because it gives an unwanted baby a brand new life in a wonderful home.
And I'm sure that's the case for some families, but recognising that that's not everybody's experience, and certainly when we're talking about forced adoption, that unlikely to be that story, is really important. I think we'll come back and talk more about some of those things you've raised, Jo, as we go today, but I think just being mindful of the language that we use around forced adoption is really important. I know that some people don't like the word adoption either, that there may be some inherent assumption in that was a choice that the person was making, which again is not the case here. So some people prefer using language around being separated from their child or having their child removed or taken from them. And there is, again, lots of variation around those things. So just being mindful of that. As always, we come back to the, guiding principle that when you're working with an individual, ask them about what language they feel comfortable with and use that language throughout your work, because everybody will have different preferences and choices. But bigger picture, just being mindful of that language, I think, is valuable for all of us. People affected by forced adoption have been included as a special needs group. And again, the language of special needs group is absolutely not inclusive. And it looks as though in the new act that is currently being drafted, that those words around special needs groups will be changed. Certainly, recognition of the lifelong and sort of widespread impact of forced adoption, the trauma involved in that, is why it's included as a special needs group within the Act, and requires us all to be thoughtful and put some energy into better understanding people's experience of those forced adoptions or removals. I've included up here a few dot points around forced adoption. I guess my first thing that I just want to acknowledge is this is a really complex issue. Within this very short workshop, we don't have an opportunity to learn about the real nuances of forced adoption and people's individual experiences. So I don't want to sort of minimise this down to a set of bullet points, but just as some sort of guiding starting points for our discussion and understanding. I've included a few ideas here about what we're talking about as a forced adoption. So primarily, I guess the main theme is that these were adoptions or children that were removed from their mothers or parents without willing or informed consent. This is a long-lasting issue, but in Australia there have been a number of inquiries. So there's a big Senate inquiry that bit over a decade ago, and that looked into the experience, and the best kind of available evidence is that within the kind of peak period of adoptions, it was around from 1950 to the 1970s, and that there are at least 150,000 adoptions that occurred in that time, and that, obviously adoption continues. It's impossible to identify exactly how many of those adoptions would be considered forced adoption. But as Joe alluded to before, certainly there were a number of policies and practices throughout Australia that meant that the what we were describing as forced adoption was widespread and systematic, that people were being separated from their children, that very often this was an issue for younger women who were potentially unwed, but not always, and that babies were removed for them. And Jude spoke to before as well, some of the manipulation and coercion. Mothers were often removed from their community as well throughout their pregnancy, as Jude spoke about before, and lied to or coerced to be able to sign the adoption papers. Very often those adoptions were closed adoptions, so there wasn't an opportunity to make it easy, I guess, to share information about each other and the experience. Sometimes both mothers and babies were institutionalised, and parents were not given information to be able to support them to make informed choices about, whether it be things like financial support or options that might be available to mothers. Jude, I was wondering if you could just speak to, is there anything there that really stands out to you about what you'd really like people to know forced adoption is?
As well as significant pressure and coercion, there was also, as I just briefly mentioned before, actual illegality. There were some babies that were paid for, that were bought and sold between doctors and adoptive parents, and babies separated from their mothers immediately and removed without consent, even prior to them being born. There were a number of young women who had sheets put up in front of their faces so there was no possibility of them seeing the baby when it was born, and also actually handcuffed to the bed, not with handcuffs, but with leather straps, quite a few. Or heroin was legal in those days, and a lot of women were given heroin or other substances to just sort them out.
One of the things that is incredibly important to note around this is the incredible secrecy and shame that surrounded the experience, and the idea that you were just supposed to pretend it had never happened and move on. I think that's a really key part of the trauma associated with this, and something that as providers we need to be mindful of moving forward. The other thing that I just want to acknowledge is that when we're talking about forced adoption in this context, it's also really important to acknowledge the stolen generations as well, where for an even longer period of time, people have been separated from their children and families. So that's, I just want to acknowledge that experience as well, which certainly the individual experience will be similar in many ways, but the broader context, there are some additional things to be thinking about there. When we look at the impact of forced adoption, again, this is a really complex issue where I have put way too many words onto one slide to try and capture some of the key ideas. And I don't want that to be overly simplistic. We've spoken about the fact that absolutely forced adoption, if we think about there being 150,000 adoptions over that period. It's not just 150,000 people, which is already a huge number of people that are impacted, but it's all of the people around them as well. That idea of intergenerational trauma is really important here, and a lifelong impact and experience. The idea that anybody would just get on with their life and forget about it and never think of it again, I imagine would be very, very, very uncommon, if not impossible. However, so that impact of trauma, grief and loss is a really important thing to be thinking about. The fact that we talked about some of the mistreatment and manipulation at the hands of professionals, hospital staff, government agencies, etc., and the discrimination that people experienced, that stigma associated with it. And for both mothers, children, and people around them, that loss of their identity and connections has a really significant impact as well. So there's lots of things within the experience itself that have a huge impact on people throughout their lives. When we're thinking about the health impact, absolutely those experiences can have an impact on people's physical health, but certainly absolutely mental health and emotional well-being longer term as well. For many people, that experience absolutely impacted the trajectory of their life, whether it was being removed from education or being isolated, being disconnected from their community. Impact, you mentioned before, Jo, on subsequent relationships, whether that be in terms of romantic relationships, but also relationships with family and others in your life. And that has a huge impact on people's life in terms of work, economic impacts on individuals and communities, etc., etc., etc. Absolutely, the impact of that shame and secrecy and guilt on people's sense of who they are, their self-esteem. And I guess as service providers, some of the things that are really important for us to be thinking about is those experiences earlier in people's lives will absolutely shape not just the person they are and how they interact with the world, but certainly how they feel about working with services, reaching out for help, identifying the need for support and services, and what kind of services might be right for them, and being able to interact with services that meet their needs. Personal records is also a really interesting point. Jo, do you want to speak to it all, the way that forced adoptions were documented, or some of those kind of bigger picture impacts on people's records?
If I can just start with a personal example, I too had my son at Queen Vic, and I decided some years ago to get my medical records from the hospital. And Queen Vic was closed down many years ago, and all of the records were moved to Monash Hospital in Clayton. And apparently a whole lot of them fell off the back of a truck, including mine. But when I first contacted the hospital, they said, you have to talk to Monash, which I did, and they said, no, you were never in there. And I said, well, that's strange, because I've got a piece of paper in front of me, which is a consent to adopt, which I signed, and was then witnessed by Pat Cox, who was the head almoner at that point. And it's got Queen Victoria Hospital on the bottom of it. So I know that I was there. Anyway, I had to go through FOI, but they still couldn't find any of my records from there. So and these sorts of things happen all the time. I'm not alone in that by any stretch. As far as those sorts of records go, it can be difficult. And that's also, I mean, that's very triggering as well. For them just to completely deny that you were ever in a hospital, therefore you didn't have the baby, therefore you're telling a lie. It's a pretty horrible thing to do to somebody who's been through all of this in the first place and had to live with it for so many years.
Many adoptions were closed. Children were issued with new birth certificates. So I imagine as well that it might have an impact on how people feel about having records made or information documented, working with services down the track as well, was something that sort of stood out to me. It's important to note that the significance of the impact of forced adoption has really been recognised, and in 2013 there was the national apology for forced adoptions that Julia Gillard provided, and that came on the back of a federal Senate inquiry. Subsequently, there's been a Victorian inquiry. There's currently an inquiry underway in Western Australia about forced adoption practices as well. So, it is significant. And the other thing I think is really important to recognise, and I was wondering if I could ask you about this, Jude, is that everybody's response in terms of wanting to and deciding whether they might speak about their experience of having a child removed or seek support or help around that comes at really different times for different people. That it's not something that lots of women would have been able to or in a position to reach out for help at the time. And so for many people, that happens a long way down the track.
It just highlights, as you said, everyone's personal experience. And even when I've sought counselling, I've just been really anxious about the ability to be heard, whether the counsellor has had extra training surrounding these issues. And I think a lot of it too stems from just this, this initial effect of the shame and secrecy and silence. So you're told your behaviour's been bad and unacceptable, you're therefore a bad person and you deserve to be punished, and you've brought disgrace upon yourself and the school and your family and the neighbourhood. And so you need to be you need to be sent away. You need to be hidden away from full view and don't say anything, don't speak to anyone. And so I think it just sets this lifelong effect, that you're then forced to deal with forevermore. So it just basically sets up this, you don't deserve to be heard, you don't deserve to speak up, and this sense of being a victim and that you deserve it, and that so you're working against all of those things about what is your right, what you deserve.
My understanding just from our previous conversations has been that for you, while you had sought counselling before and have gone on to have a really successful, full life in lots of ways, that more recently you decided to connect in with ARMS and I want to say take ownership, I'm not sure if that's quite the right word, of your experience of forced adoption and speak more openly about that's come much more recently.
Those initial messages of feeling like that you didn't have a voice and you didn't deserve almost to have a voice, and that it just becomes difficult to speak up. And so when you and I think that's what ARMS has given me, this, it's not only me being surrounded by women who just get it, because so many people that you go through, all the relationships that you have in your life, it's not that you're afraid to speak up, it's just that people just don't have a deeper understanding. They've never walked in your shoes, and you come to learn that you can't expect that either. Just this incredible relief, this weight off your shoulders when you're surrounded by other women who were there, who totally get it, who just ease that burden that you've carried, where you've had to go through training the people in your relationships, what it's been like for you, or not that you have to justify your behaviour, but you don't have to train anyone sitting around you when we have our support group meetings.
I'm really aware that this is an incredibly brief conversation into a really complex topic. And one of the things moving forward for all providers, I think, is to really recognise the importance of learning more about the experience of forced adoption. There is some specialist training available. For example, Vanish in Victoria run training programs around working with people affected by forced adoption. And there are lots of resources available to support staff. So we'll include those resources in the resource list. And I would really encourage everybody to think about how you could support your teams to learn more about this issue as well, because there is lots to unpack and understand in there. And we're certainly not doing that justice in this very brief forum today. I think that leads nicely into what do we need to be thinking about as providers of aged care services when we're working with people. And I think perhaps one of the most important things that stands out to me is that we need to recognise that lots of people will not feel comfortable disclosing their experience of adoption, and that is absolutely okay, and that is each person's choice. What is more important to recognise is that our responsibility and requirement to deliver services that are respectful and inclusive of all older people is not dependent on disclosure. You don't wait until we find out about aspects of someone's experience or circumstances before we suddenly switch on the button for inclusion. So it's really important to be thinking about how can we design and deliver our services in a way that is inclusive for all older people. Some things that stood out to me in terms of working with people with forced adoption are things like being really thoughtful about the way that we have conversations about people's social situations. So if you look in a really sort of traditional medical model style of assessment, your standard questions might be, are you married? How many children do you have? How often do they visit you? Automatically within those questions, we have potentially excluded a whole lot of people or created circumstances where people have to work around the question and, think about what they're happy to disclose. Certainly for people affected by forced adoption, if our initial get to know you question is, how many children do you have? That might be opening a whole Pandora's box of how it certainly won't be the first time that person's been asked the question, but it's not a very inclusive way to have that conversation. So reframing it to think about questions like who's important to you, who's involved in your life, those kind of things might actually give you a much more relevant picture of what we are trying to understand as providers. How many children someone has is probably not going to tell you anything particularly valuable in terms of how we might work with an older person. Equally, being really thoughtful, and I guess, as Jo mentioned before, checking your own assumptions and expectations about what relationships between parents and their children might be. Different expectations around whether it be caring roles or involvement in each other's lives. That looks different in every family. And so being thoughtful, I guess, not to put your own experience or assumptions onto the people that we're working with. We talked before about the role that government agencies, hospitals, religious organisations and a whole range of institutions played in forced adoptions absolutely might impact on how confident someone feels working with a service, concerns that they might have actually really being triggered by needing to work with different organisations or professionals along the way. And then there are things like being respectful that, special events, so whether it be things like Christmas, birthdays, Mother's Day, those things can be really challenging for a lot of people for lots of different reasons, again. And so just being thoughtful of that in your planning and how you might address those things in your organisation. At an individual level, when we're working with people, being really mindful that that trauma that people have experienced absolutely will shape who they are and their experience moving forward. Talking to people about if, for example, you've got workers going into people's homes, what do they need to feel safe and okay about having people coming in? Might be around being especially thoughtful around informed decision making and being able to make choices, having workers, matching workers that are appropriate and safe for that person. There might be a whole lot of things in there. And perhaps being really transparent about whether it be things like your documentation or decision making in general. Jo and Jude, what really stands out to you about what you'd like organisations to know around delivering services and working with people?
Well, as you were just saying, that being really mindful of what could have happened in somebody's life, and well, you mentioned before about questions that you ask, rather than how many children do you have or something like that, you could phrase it, tell me about your support network, and also with that sense of safety and trust, rather than, and I don't know how much this would happen in your particular service or type of service, but rather than making a decision for somebody and virtually just saying, here, sign on the bottom line, that can be very triggering for women who've been in our position, because that was just forced on us. And with no thought whatsoever about what our wishes were. In fact, completely to the contrary. And I can think of a number of situations that I've either been through myself or have been told about, where decisions have been made, and you go right back to that 17-year-old or 14-year-old or 20-year-old or whatever it is, where the decisions are just made and you're told, here it is, sign on the bottom line. So that's really important for a service to be aware of that, and particularly, as you said earlier, about around the conversations that you have. And sometimes they don't want a conversation.
That idea of it's not up to us to decide which parts of someone's story people tell us about, but if you are able to say, look, I need some more information, I need some more time to review this before I make a decision. If you look through that kind of trauma-informed lens, I don't need to know all of the background details about why that's especially important to you. My job is just to respect that.
If a woman did just come out one day and say, oh, look, I'm really upset today, it's my son's birthday and I've never met him. Or it's my son's birthday, but I didn't meet him until he was 30 or 40 or something. Rather than being curious, which is completely understandable, what happened, why, how did you meet him, all of that sort of thing. Rather than asking curious questions, just asking questions like, so do you have a support network around you that you can talk to, or anybody that you can talk to about this? So keeping in mind that support part of it, rather than wanting more information. And if she's prepared to give that information, well, to volunteer information, that's fine. Just listen.
Yeah. And I guess one of the really valuable things about making sure that we as service providers have a better understanding of this experience, given the number of people who are impacted by forced adoption, there is no doubt that we are currently working with lots of people that have been impacted in different ways. This is not a one-off, very rare kind of event. This is something all service providers will have clients and people around them that are impacted by forced adoptions.
Around about 1 in 7 people are affected by adoption. That's not to say they've had the baby, but around 1 in 7. So you will all know somebody. You will all know lots of people.
Being able to respond respectfully in those circumstances when someone does choose to disclose part of their story is really valuable. I know, Jude, you shared with me a little while ago some of your experiences of telling people about your experience of adoption and people just staring back at you uncomfortable and not quite sure what to do next. Is that fair?
Totally. And over the years, I've just found it, I know this sounds really weird, but I've just found it sort of amusing in a way because I've come to expect it and I just have this lighthearted response to it because it's just incredibly predictable. And so I'm not blaming or judging the response. It's just my way, I suppose, of just dealing with it.
It's almost like reaction bingo.
Yeah.
You can pick them from a checklist.
Yes. I don't mean to demean it, but that's what it's like.
So thinking about understanding people's experience better so that we can have more thoughtful conversations and we can be thinking about what people might need from us, asking better questions. We're not going to know the answer to what each person might need or want or what works for them, but it's very likely that your client will know what's going to work for them. So making sure that we're asking those questions about what people need is really important. And being able to, as you said, Jo, manage those conversations in a respectful way and thinking about I guess if you understand the trauma and grief and loss that's associated with forced adoption, then some of those issues that I know you've spoken about around things like being reunited with a child or reconnecting, being a happy ending to that story and, putting a nice bow in the box. Hopefully some of those things might go away for staff or put them in perspective a bit better. If we look now sort of at, as service providers, what we can be doing and what's really important, was wondering about, Jude and Jo, if you have any ideas about what might impact on a mother's experience of whether they might think a aged care provider was a good fit for you. Is there anything particular that you might think about in terms of a provider being a good fit?
A collaborative sort of service where there's no pressure, it goes back to those issues of coercion. I don't know how you make that decision about the right fit prior or whether it's
got to feel it out.
Yeah, and maybe have the option to say, I don't feel comfortable with this relationship. What is the mechanism for feedback and then reassessing and moving forward, and that sort of that ability to have a say and to negotiate and collaborate and not feeling any pressure that it's sort of set in concrete if a relationship is not really working for whatever reason, knowing that you do have the ability to speak up and say that, for example, I really would have a problem going to have someone accompany me to that institution, or I prefer a woman coming into the home to shower me, or those opportunities to form a relationship where it feels safe and comfortable to be able to speak up and say what I need without fear of retribution or judgment.
Making sure that people are feeling heard and listened to, and, as a potential client, knowing that that service will value what you have to say and be responsive to you. Those are really good things. That idea of a more collaborative approach and, again, in that really old school medical model style of service delivery, the staff member's the expert and will tell you what to do. I think that's outdated for lots of reasons and lots of people, but recognising that you're the expert in your life and therefore what's going to work for you is perhaps the most important thing that we can learn is sounds like a much better way of working.
Everything that Jude said was absolutely spot on. But with a lot of those things, you don't find them out until you're using the service. I'm assuming that with any of these types of services, there will be a website or a pamphlet or something that they will be able to get information from. So it would be important to have something about a diverse population and how they can be serviced.
What about a face-to-face meeting beforehand after you've maybe looked at reviews and researched online, and if there's an offer of a face-to-face meeting, and to be able to get more information in a meeting?
I think it's really interesting, Jo, if you think about what you can review and read about what providers might say about themselves online, the idea of how we work and our approach. But so some of that messaging around collaboration and working, in flexible ways, those kind of things are great. But as you both highlighted, that the actual proving it comes when people walk the walk, doesn't it? So, yeah, you have to be able to actually deliver on those things. I wonder as well, recognising the role of some major organisations and institutions in forced adoption previously, recognising that for many women, for example, working with an organisation that is a faith-based organisation might inherently not feel like a good fit. Or those organisations might have a whole lot of additional barriers to overcome to demonstrate that they could be a good fit for that person.
One of our members is currently having treatment at Peter Mac. She goes every couple of weeks, and she has to walk past the Royal Women's Hospital, which is where she had her son. And that was way more than 50 years ago. And she breaks out in a sweat when she walks, and there's no other way, unfortunately, for her to get to Peter Mac. But absolutely breaks out in a sweat, starts feeling as if she's going to be sick, and has an internal panic attack. She doesn't have an all-out panic attack, but just feels so horrible and can't do anything about it. And that for one, shows that the trauma is just ongoing, and you might find ways of dealing with it. But then if she were to come to one of your services and they said, okay, we've made an appointment for you to go to the Women's Hospital to do such and such, and she might get angry, agitated, defensive, burst into tears, have a panic attack, and the carer has no idea why any of that has happened. So she or he needs to be able to ask the questions without saying, oh, what's wrong? That's obviously brought up something for you. Would you prefer that we made the appointment elsewhere, or would you like to talk through it?
And that's, really fundamental to that trauma-informed lens that you were talking about before, isn't it? That if someone does respond in a way that might be unexpected, and it might be unexpected for them as well. Our triggers are often, certainly not planned, but we might not anticipate it. So it might not even be something as clearly linked as, scheduling a hospital appointment. It might be someone helping you with personal care or moving around in the, room or whatever it might be, that triggers something out of the blue for you, that does create that reaction. And our job is to be respectful of that and just ask the person, how can we support you? What do you need from me right now? And hopefully what would be valuable for me to share with the team so that, you feel safe, or we can support you better, or, what next? And potentially even creating opportunities to link in with someone that might, if they want to explore that work or get some more specific support, being able to link them into someone that could provide that. That leads really nicely into having a quick look at the process around applying for specialisation verification. And then I just want to speak to a couple of the criteria that are specific for working with people affected by forced adoption. For providers, in terms of applying for specialisation verification, there is a form that you need to complete online to be able to do that, and it requires you to provide evidence against a number of different criteria. AHA then review your application. The whole process usually takes around 4 weeks, and they will also speak to people who are using your service to collect feedback about whether your organisation is actually delivering services that are inclusive. There are a number of resources and materials to guide you through that application process. Again, they're all included in your resource list. Certainly this provider guidance manual is a very good place to start. It's up on the screen now. As I said, each of the different special needs groups have specific criteria that are required to provide evidence for. And I guess it's important to know that you need to provide evidence against 4 of these criteria in order to apply for specialisation verification. And you can see that those 4 people affected by forced adoption are listed here. There are things like staff who are themselves people affected by forced adoption, acting as champions in your organisation, having a specialist advisory group or representation in your governance group or board. There are those kind of broader things. Certainly, though, I think some of the ones that might be more achievable on the ground for many organisations are things like at least 90% of staff having completed ongoing training. And that, when we're thinking about training, it's really about understanding both the experiences of people affected by forced adoption, but also that trauma-informed care as well. Being thoughtful about your physical environment. And a couple of really important ones here are having ongoing connections and being engaged with relevant support services and community organisations that can support people affected by forced adoption. And having systems and connections in place with local, and so the criteria talk about dental and medical facilities, so that support can be provided to people who are triggered by accessing those services. That experience that Joe just spoke of is a really good example of how triggering accessing additional support can be for people. Bigger picture, some of the evidence around forced adoption talks about that many people who have been impacted by that kind of traumatic experience in a hospital setting are much less likely to access medical services. Might feel very uncomfortable and certainly triggered by going to those organisations or institutions, and therefore might need some extra support to do that. So being really thoughtful about what that looks like, where those connections might be in your organisation and how we could do that could be something really valuable for all organisations to be thinking about. When we talk about policies and procedures, think put it in the context of some of those things that have come up in our conversation already today. So things like absolutely having a trauma-informed care embedded into the way that you work, and that model of flexible person-centred services. Having a strategy to manage any disclosures that people might make, and being able to respond to that in a really respectful and thoughtful way, and recognising, as Jude and Joe both mentioned before, that our response to people's disclosures is really powerful and important. And so I guess being prepared for that and understanding what to do with that information could be really useful. If you've got, carers working on the ground, then making sure they understand their responsibilities in terms of asking for consent to share that information, or how that information might be recorded. It could also be challenging or bring up some things for the worker themselves if someone discloses. So being mindful about that and what support's available for the worker to follow up after those kind of disclosures might be important as well. That partnership approach, really understanding who are the organisations in your local area that are experts in this space and can provide specialised support. Jude and Joe, you've both spoken about the fact that it is almost impossible for people who haven't had a lived experience of this to understand completely that experience. But there are organisations like ARMS and Vanish out there who can provide that specialised support. That's not for everyone to suddenly become an expert. Just committing to that ongoing education. We've spoken broadly about the fact that regardless of whether you pursue specialisation verification, understanding the framework is a really useful tool to support you in your next steps in terms of your quality improvement planning, thinking about what you want to focus on and how you can support your, really diverse community. There are a number of the common themes that are coming up through these presentations around things like the importance of trauma-informed care that could really support all agencies to deliver more inclusive services for people who have experienced lots of different things in their life, and certainly forced adoption being one of those things. But that, there's some real benefit in being able to do that.
The religious control, it is part of the shame. I'm a family member of a lived experience, and religion was the decider that was brought in to shame everybody as to the reason why the baby should be taken away.
Thank you, Frances. And my understanding as well is that certainly religion as part of the rationale, I guess, behind needing to adopt out a baby might be part of that, but also the involvement of religious organisations and hospitals and government agencies. Social workers were often a really key part of the process. So understanding those people's roles and those organisational roles and positions as well is also really important for us to be aware of and thinking about.
That last point is a very good one. It was really interesting to work out that what your church felt, and the people in your church, which was a lot more prevalent back in those days, and what your next door neighbours felt and what your relatives might feel was more important than having your grandchild. Now, that's not the case in every single case, but very often that was even subconsciously the way it was seen by a lot of people.
And it's not just one faith-based group.
Every single one of them.
I think today has been probably one of the most profound training sessions that I've ever had. So thank you very much, ladies, for sharing your experiences. I was not aware of ARMS, and I have a very challenging situation here. We will speak to the lady who has experienced a forced adoption if she wants to engage with ARMS. We've been trying to help her and supported her as much as we can. She believes her child is still alive. All of the experiences that you spoke about earlier, that was hers We've made some inroads, but what we haven't been able to do is provide her with the expertise of people like Joe and Jude and your organisation. So I'll have a chat with my staff member, and if the client wants to engage with her, we'll give her the details and or Vanish. So thank you very much. This has been amazing.
I can only emphasise the amazing support that ARMS provides. It's just been immeasurable, the wonderful impact that it has been on me. So you can't apply too much pressure, can you, to your client? But I just strongly recommend ARMS from my point of view.
She's taken up every option that we've given to her, and she's explored that. And she actually came to us because she wanted to learn how to use the internet. We've got a digital inclusion program, so we've been skilling her up to do that, and she's becoming very proficient very quickly because she is desperate to get to the bottom of her story.
Thank you, Rosalie.
ARMS is purely a support group for mothers. Vanish also supports mothers and adoptees and donor-conceived people and fathers too, for that matter. So they're a bigger funded organisation. So they deal with all sides of adoption, whereas ours was purely set up to support mothers.
Each state does have funded forced adoption support services. So somewhere like Vanish also provides search and support, so individual and group-based support and counselling and assistance with things like identifying records, providing advice around reconnecting and things like that as well. So I've included the link on the DSS website to where you can find your local forced adoption support service as well. I really want to take this opportunity to say a really big thank you to Joe and Jude. I was absolutely not underselling things when I said the best part of today is being able to hear from you guys. As Rosalie said, it's really important and valuable for us to be able to hear from you and your experiences and how that translates, over to service providers and things for us to be thinking about. I certainly think you will motivate many people to continue that learning and build their understanding. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you everybody else as well for being here. Joe or Jude, is there anything final that you would like to add?
Just to reiterate, please be aware of your assumptions, and hopefully what Jude and I have said today will give you some small insight into the emotional life that these women have led and are still leading, and just to be as kind as possible, which obviously you all would be, but to challenge yourself and challenge your assumptions and look at everything as if they have been through trauma, because that's the way it is.
Really good starting point for success for working with any person, isn't it, I think? Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Jude?
If all healthcare professionals provided care based on what they've learned about the effects of trauma, I think I'll be just thrilled if that was the case. I think it should be really an across-the-board aim for all health professionals to assume, Joe's talking about assumptions, but I'd like to assume that everyone deserves the sort of care that we can learn through that trauma-affected lens.
Yeah, absolutely, Jude. Yeah, I agree with you. Big picture, the statistics say 75% of adults have experienced a traumatic event. Of course, the scope and impact of those things are really different for everybody. In aged care, we're working with older people, and therefore they've had the most time on the planet to experience a whole range of different things, including many different types of trauma. We also have our 3 remaining workshops coming up over the next couple of months. So That's certainly a great opportunity to learn. And the recordings from the first few sessions are now available as well. So if you wanted to go back and catch up on any of that, you can absolutely do that. They're really valuable conversations. I encourage you to look into that. Thank you for being here, everybody. Have a wonderful day.